Candace Owens was on the Pierce Morgan show. She was debating with another rabbi, and she's come out as an anti-Semite, as a Jew hater. I mean, you listen to her opinions. She's just, her comments about the Holocaust. When the issue of Islamist extremism was raised, that this is starting to show and emerge in the US, her reply is, there's also extremist Judaism, and you have to be careful. You have these crazy Chabad people. They're followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they have crazy extremist views. And they're following this rabbi, and they're digging tunnels at their world headquarters and throwing benches at, and she starts ragging on about Chabad, how just like there's extremist Islam, well, there's also extremist Jews. Be careful. They might give you some good cholent and chicken soup. I don't know. The initial reaction would be to be defensive. Okay, friends, the story begins. We are back. We're exploring the secrets of the Talmud, the values, ethics, and lessons from the Talmud. And we are toward the bottom of Brachot 32b. And if you're following the link on Chabad.org that I had sent, it's the second to last Hebrew paragraph of the page toward the bottom where it says the sages taught. And I think today's lesson is going to be very relevant to the times which we find ourselves in. Because what I see over here is a lesson in how to approach anti-Semites. I believe you follow people on social media or see what people post on social media, advocates for Jewish people. And I strongly believe we are approaching anti-Semitism incorrectly, because we're spending so much time trying to defend ourselves and less time trying to become ourselves. And if we were more comfortable with ourselves and needing less the validity of other people, I think we'd be in a much healthier space. With that introduction, that's not directly what the Talmud's addressing, but I think it's strongly related. Let's read it inside. You guys see it? The sages taught. There was a related incident. It's continuing from a previous incident in the Talmud. There was a related incident involving a particular pious man who was praying while traveling along his path when an officer came and greeted him. The pious man did not pause from his prayer and did not respond with a greeting. So he's in the middle of the Amidah, he's davening with concentration, and some sort of officer, a government official, comes up to him and says, "Hey," and he's just ignoring him. He's back in his book. The officer waited for him until he finished his prayer. After he finished his prayer, the officer said to him, "You good for nothing. You endangered yourself. I could have killed you." Right? That's how it works in a lot of these countries. "Isn't it written in your Torah, take utmost care and guard yourself diligently?" And that's the verse, but from which we derive the obligation to remain healthy and not put yourself in danger. He says, you put yourself in danger. You ignored a government official who has the power to take you into custody and to kill you and to do negative things to you. That should have been a priority over prayer. You could have interrupted your prayers for that. And is it also written, take therefore good heed unto yourselves? Why did you ignore the danger to your life? This is what this officer says. He's kind of messing with this Jew and using his own laws and rules and halacha to kind of mess with him. When I greeted you, why did you not respond with a greeting? Were I to sever your head with a sword, who would hold me accountable for your spilled blood? It would have been your fault. You had it coming. This is what the officer says to the guy. What does the pious man say to him? Which, by the way, that's in some ways he's right. You generally don't interrupt or pause in the middle of the Amidah because you're talking to God, unless it's a life-threatening situation. This is a life-threatening situation, right? If an officer, a police officer, were to stop you in the middle of davening while you're at the airport or whatever it is, it's questionable. Do you stop? Do you not stop, right? How big of a scene is it going to make? But if you're in a communist country, Canada, no, I'm kidding. I've been waiting for that. If you're If you're in a communist country, you're in China, you're in Russia, and an officer stops you and you don't answer, right? What might happen next? Right? If you're in Iran and you're in the middle of talking to God, you're davening, and you don't stop, you have to stop. So he says that the blood would have been on your hands. You're doing something wrong. Now, it's interesting, by the way, just to point out that the officer didn't actually kill him. He was just messing with him, right? He didn't actually say what he was going to do. He was just being theoretical over here, philosophical about it. The pious man said to him, "Wait for me until I will appease you with my words." In other words, I have a good explanation over here. He said to him, "Had you been standing before a flesh and blood king, a physical king, and your friend came and greeted you, would you return his greeting?" This is what the pious man asks him. Let's go to the top of 33:8. The officer says to him, "No." The pious man continued, "And if you would greet him, what would they do to you?" So you're standing in front of a king in his palace. He's king's on his throne. And you're standing right there, and you start chatting with somebody else. What would that king do to you? The officer said to him, "They would cut off my head with a sword." The pious man said to him, "Isn't this a matter? Isn't this matter a fortiori inference?" There's no good English word for that, but in Hebrew we say kal v'chomer, which means, how do we translate kal? Is there a good translation for this? Somebody shared with me once a translation they use in the legal terms, but
Isn't it something like something follows logically because of
exactly,
like B has to be true if A is true.
exactly. Like if I can reach the top shelf, Rabbi Raleigh for sure can reach the top shelf,
Yeah.
right?
Didn't you
So
say a term fortiori or something?
yeah, but I think that's like a French word, no?
It's from Latin, but we use it in
We
English.
use it in English. Okay, fine. Fortiori in Hebrew we say kal v'chomer. You are standing before a king of flesh and blood in whom you fear is limited because today he's here, but tomorrow he's in the grave. So you're afraid of a king of flesh and blood. You'll respect him and not just be distracted and talk to somebody else, even though he's here temporarily. He's not eternal. Would you have reacted in that way? Right? I, who is standing and praying before the supreme King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be he, who lives and endures for all of eternity. All the more so, I could not pause to respond to someone's greeting. If you're afraid or have reverence for a temporary king, shouldn't we have reverence for an eternal king? Now, mind you, this is an anti Semite. I don't know if he believes in God necessarily, right? Maybe not the same version of God, but this is what he's saying. How did the officer react to this? When he heard this, the officer was immediately appeased, and the pious man returned home in peace. Okay, a number of questions, practical questions come up here, which is, where does this pious man get this piousness to ignore the officer at the expense of his life? There's something called in the Talmud a chassid shoteh. You know what a chassid shoteh means? A chassid means a pious person, literally. A shoteh means a fool. And sometimes a person could be a foolish, pious person, and that's frowned upon. The Talmud gives several examples of a chassid shoteh, of a pious fool. Somebody who sees somebody drowning, he says, "I should save him." Oh, it's a woman. I can't save her. That would be physical contact, right? That's called a chassid shoteh. That's a pious fool, right? Obviously, life would be the priority. Saving somebody's life would be the priority. And Jewish law of not touching the opposite gender, right, would be suspended. The Talmud gives another example. Let's say, there's a Jewish welfare program in the Bible, right, called shichecha and leket and peah, right, the corner of your field that you have to leave and the sheaves of your field that you had forgotten to collect while you're reaping your field, but you're supposed to, or harvesting your field, you're supposed to leave it for the poor people, right? Now, how do you define poor people? Right, there's an income level that the Talmud talks about, and somebody who's just below the income level, and now you give him a quarter for charity, out of the kindness of your heart, and you put him above the income level, but now you're starving the guy because he can't collect that charity anymore, right? In the name of kindness, it's called the Chassid Shotep. I'm just giving random examples in the Talmud of Chassid Shotep, of a foolish, pious person. He's not really pious. He's more foolish than he is pious, obviously, right? We say pious facetiously. Over here, we don't refer to this man as a foolish, pious person. He's just a pious person. And it sounds like we see his behavior as something commendable, something we want to learn from. This is how we do it during prayer. We stand up. What is going on here? So there are a number of commentaries that address this. Some of them say the fact that the officer had introduced himself. He already knew this was heading in the right direction, that he's messing with me. He's not actually going to kill me, right? He was able to read the situation. But there are some commentaries that take this, that see this very differently. Why was he allowed to put his life in danger and not respond to the officer? He didn't even notice the officer. That's the real answer. He was praying. He was davening to God. He was connecting with God. When we're standing and connecting with God, you're like on a date. You go on a date with your spouse, you shut off your phone. Talking with God, I shut off the world. Nobody else matters. This anti-Semite was irrelevant. That's why he didn't answer him. The real reason why he didn't answer him. And if I'm not going to sacrifice my relationship to answer the phone. I'm not going to sacrifice my connection with God because you want to say, hey, why didn't you answer me while we were praying? In other words, this fellow was so comfortable with his relationship with Hashem, so comfortable with his Jewish identity. He didn't care about the other guy, about the anti-Semite. It wasn't like, please don't distract me, and this is why it's important that I pray, and let me justify. It's like, hey, bro, I'm in the middle of something. Come back to me soon. He didn't even give him the attention. When I read this story in the Talmud, the first thing that came up in my mind was what's going on in current events of Jews in Israel being blamed for things they aren't doing, and us thinking that we need, us as a community, thinking that we need to justify ourselves. We have to justify why it's okay to protect ourselves, or why it's okay to publicly be Jewish and wear a kippah on campus, and why it's necessary, and why Israel's necessary because there was a Holocaust, and we need this safety space, and please understand it. Why do we need to explain this to the world? If we are comfortable in our identity, I'm not saying we shouldn't explain this to the world. I'm saying we shouldn't feel like we need to explain it to the world for their validity, because we have a stronger sense of validity deep down inside. I reflect back on the story of the Exodus of Egypt. The night before the Exodus, Hashem commands the Jewish people to paint the doorposts with blood. Jewish people should remain in their homes. The angel of death is going to come and slay the firstborn of all Egyptians. And it's important that the Jewish people stay indoors, shelter, stay at home. I remember when the shelter in place during COVID 4 or 5 years ago took place. It was around the time where it was around Pesach time, and everybody was referencing this quote in the Bible: shelter at home, stay in place for Pesach, right? This was the first Passover, and we were commanded to shelter at home. Why? So the basic reason, and this is the reason Rashi brings, is that this angel of death, get out of the way. The Egyptians are out and about. The angel of death is going to kill them, and you stay at home and just don't get in the way. One of the commentaries, known as the Abarbanel, one of my favorite commentaries. It's really a lot of fun, a lot of interesting explanations. By raise of hands, have you heard of the Abarbanel? His name is Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel. Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel originally lived in Spain. I know I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here. I hope you're okay with it. Rav Yitzchak Abarbanel lived in Spain in 1500s. He was an accountant and a rabbi. You know whose accountant he was? King Fernando and Queen Isabella. He was their accountant. And when it came time for the expulsion and all the Jews are being kicked out of Spain, he's packing his bags and they say, we're going to offer you the opportunity to stay because you're a good accountant and you get to stay. He says, no, I'm not leaving my people. If the Jews are going, I'm going. And he ended up leaving. And unfortunately, as a result of that, he lost a lot of his writings as well. He then moved to Italy. Fascinating. Okay, sorry, that was all in brackets. Brackets closed. The Abarbanel says, why shelter in place? The angel of death doesn't know, and God doesn't know that these are Jews, these are Egyptians, kill these people, don't kill these people. It's going to get confused. Remember the story of Kamsa, Bar Kamsa? We discussed a couple of weeks ago, our last Talmud class, right? So you're going to get confused. He doesn't know. So the Abarbanel says there's a different reason why we needed to shelter in place. What's going to happen? The angel of death is coming and killing the firstborns. What's Pharaoh going to do? Guys, get out of Egypt. And we're going to be tempted to run out of Egypt because Pharaoh just gave us permission. Shelter in place. You don't need Pharaoh's permission to leave Egypt. You're not leaving Egypt and you're not going to be free because Pharaoh says you're free. You're going to be free because God says you're free. So shelter in place, and you're going to go out not in the middle of the night when Pharaoh releases you out of pressure, but when God redeems you in broad daylight the next morning. That's when you're going to get to go. That's when you're going to get to leave. In other words, the validity of our freedom is not coming from Pharaoh. It's coming from God. The validity of us being the Jewish people, of us having a connection to our promised land, does not come from the UN or from CNN or any of these people. We don't need their validity. We don't need to explain it to them. It comes from God. I'm sorry if I'm getting a little political here, but and I might get canceled for this. But what the heck? No, I'm kidding. Just yesterday, Candace Owens you guys saw this? Candace Owens was on the Piers Morgan show. She was debating with another rabbi. Yeah, exactly. I see the comment there. She was debating with another rabbi who was also controversial for other reasons, which we won't get into on the air. And she's come out as an anti-Semite, as a Jew hater. I mean, you listen to her opinions. She's just her comments about the Holocaust, her comments about, and when the issue of Islamist extremism was raised, that this is starting to show and emerge in the US, her reply is there's also extremist Judaism, and you have to be careful. You have these crazy Chabad people. They're followers of the Lubavitcher Rebbe, and they have crazy extremist views. And they're following this rabbi who died 30 years ago, and that they're continuing to follow his path, and they're digging tunnels at their world headquarters and throwing benches at, and she starts ragging on about Chabad, how just like there's extremist Islam who wants to kill people in the name of jihad because they don't believe what you believe. Well, there's also extremist Jews. Be careful. Right? They might give you some good cholent and chicken soup. I don't know.
They'll ask you if you've rapped today.
Yeah, exactly. It's I feel and the reason why I mention this is because the initial reaction from any Jew who would respect the Lubavitcher Rebbe would be to be defensive and to start explaining how she's incorrect and how she said some horrible things as well, which we don't need to get into. You can watch it on YouTube. But to explain why she's incorrect and why that's a lie and why she's misleading people and why we have to explain ourselves, we have to justify our existence. And then I read this story in the Talmud of this pious person who has a connection and doesn't care about the officer. Why do I need to justify my existence to Candace Owens or to the world watching her? Who cares? The best response is to feel very strong about who I am. Maybe we will respond to her. Maybe somebody will respond to her. But the moment we feel the need to be defensive is the moment that we've lost focus on who we really are. And that's a problem. The moment we're very focused on who we are, like that pious person in prayer. I'm using this pious person in prayer as a model to understand our general connection with God, which is inseparable. And the more comfortable we are with that, the more we don't care about these officers bothering us from the outside. Reminds me of the story of Purim. Esther was afraid to be proud of her Jewish identity. She was afraid to serve as an advocate for the Jewish people. Right? Mordecai says, go in there. She says, I can't. They're going to kill me. They're going to, the king doesn't respect you. He says, you think you ended up in this position by accident? You think you're a Jew who happens to be the queen and the Jews happen to be in trouble and you happen to have the ability to save them and it's not your job? He says, go. And she ends up going. And the first thing she does, first of all, she fasts. She does teshuvah. She does, which is not usually the best thing you want to do before, fasting and stuff, before going into a king after you haven't seen him for 30 days. And it's not going to impress him. But that wasn't her goal. Her goal was to become more comfortable with her Judaism, her comfortable with her relationship with God. And she walks in and she tells the king, after the banquet and after a series of various events, that there's somebody who wants to eradicate my people, and this is causing a lot of pressure on me. He says, "Who's your people? Who is this?" It says, "It's Haman. He wants to kill the Jewish people." And she reveals that she's Jewish. Immediately, she earns the respect of Achashverosh. She earns the respect of the king. The moment she was comfortable with her Judaism was the moment that the Jewish people were respected. The moment we feel that we need to respond to Candace Owens because we need to be defensive. The moment that we feel that our freedom comes from Pharaoh rather than God. The moment that we feel that we need to start justifying our connection to God to this officer who's bothering us, we're missing the point. We're not connecting properly. The solution to anti-Semitism, I'm not saying that we should not serve as advocates and throw these things in the garbage, but I'm saying that if that's the starting point, I believe that's a problem. It's not going to work. If we want to remain strong in our Jewish identity and shut down anti-Semitism and anti-Semites and Jew haters, we have to be very comfortable with who we are. Very comfortable with who we are. I want to share with you another story. I've shared with you this story in the past, but I think it's very relevant to our discussion right now. In the 1920s, there was a mentor, a mashpia, in the Chabad yeshiva system. His name was Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman. Shlomo Chaim Kesselman was a special teacher in the yeshiva. He would teach Chassidus and he would mentor the young students, inspire them, and farbrengen with them. He was very committed to the extent that the yeshiva was constantly on the run, constantly moving, because yeshiva was actually illegal in communist Russia and had to move every few months, and he would move with it. It went from Lubavitch to Rostov to, I don't know, it's a bunch of different places. Eventually it made its way to Israel, and eventually it made its way to America. He's teaching in the evening, a Tanya class to young students, maybe teenagers, I don't know, underground in a basement. And they have two students on the outside watching to make sure the KGB doesn't come, or to inform him should the KGB come. And at some point, the KGB got word that this Tanya class was taking place in the evenings. So they had sent an officer to come beforehand, go into the classroom in the basement, hide behind the door, and basically make a surprise arrest. So in the middle of his class, he's getting all into it. He's and passionate, and he's really just, people are soaking it in. And the officer pops out with his rifle and says, "Now what do you have to say?" Without skipping a beat, Rav Shlomo Chaim looks up, slams his fist on the table and says, Myriv, let's pray. Evening service. Right? Class is over. That's what I have to say. I totally dismissed the guy. He was so comfortable with his Judaism. He was so comfortable with what he was doing. He was so confident that what he was doing is the truth and it can not do it because this is what's going to bring light and goodness to the world. He didn't care about that officer. He was like the chassid in this story, just praying, and I don't care about this guy. Dismiss him. And the guy respected it. You know what the guy did? He let them finish Myriv. Then he arrested Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman. Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman ended up getting a citation. He had to do community service. He had to do street cleaning. Rav Shlomo Chaim Kesselman used to wear his Shabbos clothing to street cleaning because to him it wasn't something he bickered about and like, why me? It was a badge of honor. He knew why he was doing the street cleaning. It was because he was so proud and confident with who he was. If you look at the end of the story, what was the officer's ultimate reaction? He didn't just leave this Jew alone. It says, when he heard this, the officer was immediately appeased, and the pious man returned home in peace. And the commentaries point out that the officer started off as an enemy and turned out eventually to be an advocate, to be a supporter, to the point that this guy was able to leave in peace with protection. Because when we're comfortable with our Judaism, when we're comfortable with who we are, when we're proud of who we are, nothing can get in the way. When we have a strong, stable connection with God, what can be stronger than that? Okay, that's my story, and I'm sticking to it.
I'm waiting for the recording to finish.